Welcome to Conversations on Nationalist Hub. Today we have with us a very eminent person at the Nationalist Hub studio, Sri Jayashankar Rajagopalan. Born in North Paravur in Kerala, he was educated in Coimbatore, Hyderabad and New Delhi. He was a professor of English language and literature and linguistics by career. One of the turning points in Sri Rajagopalan's life came about in 1995 when he met His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. Sri Rajagopalan was initiated in the Vajrayana sadhana by His Holiness the 17th Galang Karmapa, His Eminent Dzongzar Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, the Rajguru of Bhutan. Sri Rajagopalan is also currently serving on the Royal Commission of Education for Bhutan and also has been serving the committees on education and education policies of the Government of India. Sri Rajagopalan also practices Jyotishya Shastra as well. He is an ardent supporter of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan cause and naturally knows the issue in depth. Welcome to the show, Sri Rajagopalan. Thank you for being here in the Nationalist Hub studio. I appreciate that you took your time out to come and meet us despite very hectic schedule that you have for the 2 days in Hyderabad. Thank you very much. Let's start. As someone who is involved in the Tibetan cause and having gone through it in detail, the relationship with Dalai Lama, can you give us a brief background about the Tibetan issue, especially Dalai Lama's decision to leave Tibet at that point in time and seek asylum in India? Many in today's generation are not really aware of what happened then. The oldies might still know it, but the new generation, the present generation, are not even aware of what the Tibetan cause is all about. They just know that there is a wonderful place called Dharmashala, there is Bailakuppe down south. It's more of esoteric kind of concept. But can you tell us more about the entire issue, what happened there?
We may all know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been in India as a guest. In fact, India's longest serving guest since 1959. Now, only a very few in mainland India, I think, know that there is a background to this.
Sure.
Now, Tibet and China have had a troubled relationship from way back in history. And the gurus of Tibet, the Dalai Lamas, and before the Dalai Lamas, the Gyalwang Karmapas, some of them have served as the royal gurus in the courts of the Chinese emperors. In fact, the 2nd, 3rd and 5th Karmapa, we are talking about the 12th, 13th century CE, taught in China and offered spiritual advice to the emperors of China. So the connection between Tibet and China goes way back in history. In our own times, if we see, the 13th Dalai Lama was the one who tried to modernize Tibet, and before he could complete his mission of modernizing Tibet, he passed away at the age of 58. And even during his time, we are talking about 1912, the end of the Qing dynasty. There was trouble in China, and Chinese troops were driven out of Tibet in 1912-13. Prior to that, just a few years before 1912-13, His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama had to be in India as in exile.
So it was not the present Dalai Lama. The previous Dalai Lama also had fled from Tibet. I think
Yes.
somewhere in 1912 he went back, I think so, is it?
1913, after the last Chinese soldier was driven out of Tibet, he went back and carried on his work regarding modernization of Tibet till he passed away. Now this is about the 13th Dalai Lama. The 14th Dalai Lama, who was born in 1935, was declared the Dalai Lama at the age of 6 or so. And as we know, in 1949, the People's Republic of China comes into being. Within a year of the People's Republic of China coming into being, they set their eyes on Tibet. And by 1951, and we are talking about a young Dalai Lama here, right? 15, 16-year-old Dalai Lama had to witness the slow but deliberate incursions of the Chinese into Tibet. By 1951, almost all of Tibet was taken by the People's Liberation Army. And the Tibetans were forced into what we now know infamously as the 17-point agreement.
Correct.
Where things like Tibetans will unite and drive out imperialist powers, return to the motherland, and so on, were incorporated. To soothen matters, His Holiness the Dalai Lama visited China in 1954-55, had meetings with Mao Zedong.
At that point in time.
At that point in time, and we are talking about a 19-year-old Dalai Lama meeting with...
Not really a mature Dalai Lama that we see now.
Yeah.
And in fact, I remember when you mentioned Mao, there was a point in time also that famine, the famous famine of when thousands, lakhs and millions of people died basically, both in China and in Tibet. I think that was the time that he met Mao.
Yes, that was the time he met Mao. And that was also the time when Mao told him religion is poison and so on. So this was how China slowly gained control over Tibet. And in 1959, March, between the 10th of March and the 23rd of March, Chinese troops surrounded the summer palace of His Holiness, where he was staying at that time. His Holiness was invited to a dance music program hosted by the People's Liberation Army. The condition was that His Holiness should go alone.
Very strange.
So the Tibetans have a tradition of consulting an oracle whenever they deem it fit to do so, during times of trouble, etc. So the oracle was consulted. The first time the oracle was consulted, it emerged that His Holiness should remain in Tibet. Everyone saw it as a threat to his life.
True.
Because he was invited alone. He was asked to go alone. So the first oracular pronouncement was that His Holiness should remain in Tibet and take care of his people. The second oracular pronouncement also was similar. The third time that the Dalai Lama called for an oracular pronouncement, it was revealed that he should leave Tibet. So that was how, in March 1959, he left Tibet and entered India as a refugee.
It was a very risky journey. I remember reading it when my college days as to how risky that journey was, passing through those the Himalayan range mountains to reach India. I mean, there must have been quite a lot of determination, because he was leaving his home country, so to speak of, and coming to India as a refugee technically. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it must have been a terrible journey for all we know. But the images, the original images that we have, photographs and so on of the journey, reflect a certain radiance that can only emerge from a divine person like His Holiness. He doesn't appear too tired or broken. There is a wonderful movie which people who are interested in this on this issue can watch. Martin Scorsese's Kundun.
Yes.
It has wonderful depictions of His Holiness's life, right up to this stage in 1959, where he left Tibet.
I mean, if you look at China's interference, I mean, you talk to the Qing dynasty, and before that, there was a lot of Mongolian influence. There was even Russian influence. And to a point in time when the British, they were ruling India, they even had an outpost in Lhasa. Now, every other nation wanted a piece of action in Tibet. And obviously, China didn't want any of them there. That was a very, very strategic reason for them to have Tibet in place so that they could influence whatever happened there. But since the Chinese had entered Tibet, and we saw this before the Dalai Lama left, even before the 13th Dalai Lama came in, there was a lot of destruction as the PLA moved in, or whatever they were called earlier in the dynasties, of destroying Tibetan monasteries. A sure sign that they wanted to get rid of that particular religious influence that was there, the Buddhist religious influence that was there. And systematically, the People's Republic of China ensured that they destroyed the sanctity of the Tibetan monastic institutions. Looking back, do you think the Chinese really succeeded in doing it?
They did a lot of the destroying part, but I don't think they can claim any success in this. I'll give you a few instances. You see, one, apart from the physical destruction of the monasteries, they have also attempted to destroy the monastic institutions, like after the Dalai Lama, in the hierarchy, the next highest ranking Lama is the Panchen Lama. And the Panchen Lama is important in the Tibetan tradition because the Panchen Lama plays a big role in the selection of the next Dalai Lama. So the current Panchen Lama, the 11th Panchen Lama, was just abducted. Nobody knows where he is now.
Okay. So that's again a typical Chinese way of working.
Typical Chinese way of working. Another instance is, if we look at the next highest ranking Lama, as it were, the Karmapa, the Gyalwang Karmapa. The current Gyalwang Karmapa, the 17th Karmapa, had to escape from China in order to escape from communist influence. So he escaped from China and arrived as a refugee in Dharamshala, where he had been subsequently nurtured by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. False cases were foisted on him, saying that, he's running a currency racket. This was during the UPA that all this was foisted on him. And luckily the courts threw out the case. But then, due to various reasons, this current 17th Gyalwang Karmapa is holed up in the Dominican Republic. He can't even return to India.
That's again very strange. I mean, why all the places it's Dominican Republic? One would expect him to be in the Indian subcontinent somewhere.
There are some travel document issues which the government of India is trying to address and resolve. So this is the way in which institution after institution, the Communist Party of China has tried to destroy in Tibet. Panchen Lama is, we don't know where the Panchen Lama is. The current Karmapa cannot actively teach and conduct his dharmic affairs in India. So this is how the Chinese have attempted to destroy monastic institutions in Tibet.
In fact, if you, as you rightly know it, that when the Dalai Lama fled from China, it was not just in India that the Tibetan refugees settled in. They also went to Nepal. A lot of them went to Bhutan also. There were various issues in Bhutan, and also in Nepal they had some other issues. But India was like a second home to them, all of them. Down the order, when you see Tibet as an issue, I remember during rock concerts, during football games in Europe, or even for that matter, whenever a Chinese official visited India, there used to be a huge amount of demonstration by the Tibetans in exile in India against these people. But over a period of time, the Tibetans themselves, maybe the Dalai Lama himself, has accepted the fact that now Tibet is a part of China. There's nothing much we can do about it. What is the entire political take on this issue?
For some time now, for a couple of decades now, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been advocating what he calls the middle path, by which he means that he is not asking for total independence from China. He is only asking for meaningful autonomy, where Tibetans will have the freedom to pursue their dharmic religious matters, to preserve their culture, and that's it. All other things like finance, defense, foreign affairs can be handled by China, is what His Holiness has been saying for about 2 decades now. So that is the political stand, as it were, from the Tibetan point of view. Regarding the protests that you were mentioning, I think there is a way in which this has to be seen, in the sense Delhi has had places which were earmarked for protests, Jantar Mantar. Yeah. So that culture itself is now changing.
True.
That culture of protesting for each and everything is changing. And besides that, the leading political heavyweights in India who used to support the Tibetan cause, like George Fernandez, for instance, they are not around now.
True. I remember George used to have, it was like his home was a kind of a refuge for all Tibetans. They could walk in any time, stay there. I distinctly remember George catering to that. Because why I asked this question was, there are some countries which still protest against them being annexed, for example. Hong Kong being a classic example. Hong Kong and Macau both were European powers at one time. Britain ceded Hong Kong with certain conditions, and those conditions are still violated, but they were protested against. But whenever something happens in Hong Kong, it gets a lot of publicity. But we don't see that if something happens in Lhasa at the same time. Do you agree with it?
Certainly, we don't know what is happening in Lhasa, because that's how the Chinese run their media, you see. So, leave alone Lhasa, we don't have any real information about what is actually happening in Tibet. The only information that we keep getting is from certain reliable sources. And we do have reliable sources that provide us information about what is happening in Tibet. So those are the only sources. Otherwise, there is no media in China, as we all know.
It's their controlled media, yes. State-controlled media as such. Now, when you look at the Doklam issue, which happened on the other side of Bhutan, Arunachal Pradesh, which China says is their territory, despite Dalai Lama himself later on agreeing, saying that yes, Arunachal is a part of India. Earlier, he was not that clear about it. And of course, recently, yes, just 2 days ago, the agreement signed between in the presence of Amit Shah between Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, reinforcing the fact that Arunachal is a part of India. On the other hand, let's look at Ladakh. A huge part of Ladakh got swallowed by China, the Aksai Chin as we call it today. And so technically, the Kashmir map is not what actually it looks like. On one side, Pakistan has taken away the POK. Another side, China has taken. When you look at Dalai Lama as a figure, I mean, it is just that he is the 14th Dalai Lama. We don't know who is going to be the 15th. Who will nominate the 15th? We all know the Chinese control everything now in Tibet. In terms of India's security, do you think Dalai Lama is an inspirational figure who stands between a very aggressive China and a combatant India in the recent times?
Certainly. If you look at the upper Himalayan areas of our states like Himachal Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh, is all Dalai Lama territory. One only has to be there to know this. So his influence in these areas is incredible. in that sense, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has a huge role to play in India's border security. In the sense, his writ runs in these areas as a whole.
That is good.
And it's always a joy to see the Tibetan flag, which is a non-existent entity anyway, because Tibet is not a free country. So it's always a joy to see the Tibetan flag alongside the tricolor, because this to me is what His Holiness stands for. Cultural autonomy, dharmic autonomy for Tibet, and peace on India's borders is, I think, what he represents.
In fact, if you look at the Tibetan concept itself, in terms of the Buddhist lineage that they have from India, what Dalai Lama, as I understand, is trying to preserve is the cultural motifs of Tibet, as you rightly said, be it at Bailakuppe down south near Coorg, Kodagu, or at Dharmasala and various other places that the Tibetans in exile live. Do you think over the years there was a first migration that came with Dalai Lama himself? Then there was a second one which happened when China opened up for tourism and a lot of people left Tibet and came to India. The third way, which we are told, is that parents of the Tibetans are sending the children to India for them to learn their culture, their identity, their religion, and more of it in depth. Do you think over looking, say, a couple of centuries from now, I know it's too far to gaze that forward, but do you think the Tibetans, especially the coming Dalai Lamas, will seek to preserve that identity of Tibetanism, if you can call it that way?
As you rightly said, they have preserved it and preserved it well so far. And I can only foresee the same trend and tradition continuing of Tibetan motifs, Tibetan culture, tradition being preserved distinctly, but yet part of the larger Indian landscape. Because His Holiness has always said that Tibetan Buddhism comes from Nalanda. It is a Nalanda tradition that has now taken the form of Tibetan Buddhism. And so, Tibetan Buddhism with its distinctiveness, but against the backdrop of the ancient Nalanda tradition. So this is the way I think the whole thing will be preserved for posterity too.
In fact, one of the things that I was told when I was speaking to certain Tibetans, the elders especially, is the fact they were worried that the youngsters, those who are just in this generation which is there in the 20s and 30s, are moving on to various Indian cities from the traditional places like Dharmasala or be it Bailakuppe for work. They want to work, they want to make a living out of it. Do you think over a period of time, this movement away from these kind of distinct places that were reserved for the Tibetans will dilute the Tibetan population there, and will you see a decrease in the number of monks coming into the order?
About the number of monks coming into the order is a different question, I think. But about the Tibetans themselves moving to other cities, that's a very interesting question. Like Bangalore is one place where Tibetans have started settling more and more in a big way. And in this process, rather than seeing the whole thing getting diluted, we are only seeing more dharma centers, teaching centers coming up in places like Bangalore, where eminent teachers keep going and teaching. Like for instance, in Delhi, I was told a month ago, a very high Rinpoche, the reincarnation of His Holiness's principal tutor, Ling Rinpoche, was His Holiness the Dalai Lama's principal tutor. His reincarnation, the young Ling Rinpoche, taught in Mayur Vihar in Delhi for 2 weeks just a month ago. So this is the kind of continuity of preservation of tradition that we are seeing, rather than seeing any kind of dilution.
Why I asked that question was typically when I've been thrice to Bailakuppe and to the monastery there. Indians look at the monastery, I'm talking from an Indian perspective, be it Dharmasala or be it Bailakuppe and other places. They look at monasteries as more of a touristy spot. They look at kind of, oh, this is away from the run-of-the-mill stuff that we see, and wow, it's a lovely thing. I've seen them not even maintaining silence at this place, to an extent that boards have been put up saying, please maintain silence, there is prayer going on inside. But do you think over a period of time, I talked to the elders earlier, the start of the conversation, they know what Tibet was all and what the issue was. But I think the younger generation of today absolutely has no idea what the Dalai Lama went through or what the Tibetans went through for centuries now. Do you think there is a need? Of course, we saw this Pradhan Mantri hosting a global summit on Buddhism just 2 days ago. And that is where I think slowly India has started, kind of imposing the fact or putting the fact across that, look, we are the place from where Buddhism originated, or be it from the place where Nagarjuna Sagar came up, from various facets of Buddhism after post-Buddha into Mahayana and other forms. So do you think the Indians have also need to understand? Do you think we need a bit more education from the Tibetan side to tell Indians, look, this is what Tibetan religion, or whatever you want to call it, is all about?
Certainly, as you rightly said, the elder generation of Indians, some of them who were witness to His Holiness leaving Tibet, coming to India as a refugee and so on, their memory is now only their memory. The younger generation needs to reconnect to this. Why? Because His Holiness and Tibet are important for India's borders. This is something I can never be tired of saying.
True.
The northern Himalayan borders, the security there of the borders, and His Holiness and the Tibetan issue are intricately connected. The more we invest in the idea of a free and secure Tibet, the more India's own borders will be free and secure.
That is where the Indo-Tibetan border police comes into play. A large part of the Tibetan population, if you can call it that way, are being slowly brought into focus, into giving full-time employment to them also, so that they feel a part of India. But I mean, if you look at it that way, Dalai Lama's recent controversy with a young boy, look how media twists the entire thing. They wait for an opportunity. We know that the Chinese state-controlled media and media within India, which are financed by the leftist from across the world and by various other organizations, they look for an opportunity, a small slip there. But can you explain what exactly was that process which you were rightly defending on social media very vigorously? I mean, do you think the media just blew it up?
They not only blew it up, but misrepresented the whole thing completely. What actually happened was that there was some kind of an investiture ceremony for students passing out of some institute. About 200 of those students were being addressed by His Holiness on 18th of March, or whichever day it was. And in order to welcome His Holiness to the venue, a coconut had to be broken. And to break the coconut, this family, the boy's family, was invited. The boy was there, his parents were there. The boy broke the coconut. None of this was shown. Huh?
Only the part which was controversial was, or what was supposed to be controversial.
Yes. So the part in which the boy was breaking the coconut, which was his actual role that day, was never shown. And after that, after the ceremonies were over, the boy walked up to His Holiness and asked him, "Can I hug you?" And there is a Tibetan tradition of display of grandfatherly love, in which sweetmeats, candy, etc. would be shared by the grandfather to the child. And if it came to a point where there are no candies to be shared anymore, the elder would say, "Now eat my tongue."
Oh,
That is,
I think that is there in every grandparent in India also. When they exhibit that kind of love, maybe in different forms. I think this is why I said again and again that that we don't understand what the Tibetan customs are, and our media too has absolutely zero idea. Please carry on, sir.
so now we know that there are around 600 of these Chinese assets working worldwide to carry out the brief from Beijing, which is malign the image of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, discredit the Tibetan cause, and create confusion in the minds of people. So this is another instance where they try to do it, but this time I think rather than His Holiness's image being discredited, we are seeing, and I'm taking joyfully, that more and more of his followers, devotees, supporters, and even fence-sitters are rallying around His Holiness in his support. We are beginning to see that by the day.
For a person from Kerala who was born in Kerala, taught in Delhi, Hyderabad, Coimbatore, you were a part of the faculty at University of Hyderabad here. Your meeting with Dalai Lama in 1995, as we close this conversation and just coming to that point, how did it change you as a person?
This happened in 1995 when His Holiness was addressing a public gathering in the Convocation Hall of IIT Delhi. There were notices put up in our hostels, and some of my hostel mates pointed out the notices to me, saying, "Did you see that? His Holiness is coming." At that point of time, I only knew of His Holiness as a Nobel laureate, nothing more. Anyway, since my friends had requested me to accompany them, I went. And the moment His Holiness entered the podium, I broke down crying. I don't know why, what happened. And since then, it has been an enduring relationship with His Holiness, the other Tibetan masters who have initiated and guided me, as well as the entire Tibetan community, whom I see as crucial to India's key interests.
In fact, as we end this conversation, there's one nation that comes to my mind always, which I don't know whether it similarly represents Tibet as such, was Israel. If you look at the history of Israel, right from the time they were driven off their own country, they went out, they came and settled even in places like Kerala and Gujarat and even Mumbai, built their own synagogues, kept their culture alive. And when the nation was reacquired or retaken by themselves, they got their nation back, they went back and they set up their own religious motifs there also and created the Torahs and other things that were there, the synagogues. Do you think one day, maybe not in our generation, maybe 3-4 generations later, the Chinese will realize that, look, we cannot control Tibet. Maybe we need to let it go. Maybe not the entire Israel way, but somewhere along the way, half autonomy to the Tibetans. Do you think that will happen during, say, 200 years from now?
I don't think it will even take 200 years. I don't want to sound hyperbolic here, but it is my sense that within the lifetime of the 14th Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, there will be big changes in China that will bring meaningful autonomy to occupied Tibet. And I say this unflinchingly.
That's a crucial word. I love that word called occupied Tibet. As much as we say Pakistan occupied Kashmir, that is what Tibet is all about, because they are people who can actually fight back, and they've shown it along their centuries of fight back with various dynasties who came from China and Mongolia and even Russia for that matter. Shri Rajagopalan, thank you very much for sparing your time. I know I should pronounce your name in full as Mr. Jayashankar Rajagopalan. Thank you very much for sparing your time and coming to us and speaking to us Nationalist Hub today. I know we could go on with this conversation, but you have a very tight schedule for the day. And in a sense, that espousing of the cause of Tibetanism from an Indian perspective, which is very important for us to learn what are the various facets that actually confront Tibet today, the Tibetans in India, the 14th Dalai Lama, and the road ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, Tibet is not something that we should just say, oh wow, wonderful place for a holiday. No, far beyond it. Tibet is a cultural crucible, that we can call it that way. It is something that we in India have to look up to, because that is something that can actually protect us from a demon called China on the other side. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a bit of history and a bit of geography for all of us. Thank you for watching.
Please subscribe to Nationalist Hub English channel for more interesting videos, and don't forget to like and share this video. Nationalist Hub, it's a news revolution.